been a while since we've talked
It was
about it.
Greco-Roman in high school. I did club wrestling as well, and so
Uh-huh.
Greco and freestyle. But I really did well in Greco, which then got me into judo and jiu-jitsu later. So
I wish I had been better at the Greco style, the upper body style,
yeah.
because it's part of folk style, collegiate
Oh yeah.
style, whatever. But if you're not confident and comfortable there, you're at a great disadvantage when you get against somebody who is. And so I wish that
Very different scoring.
do you know Helgeson, Jeff Helgeson, Lynchburg City Councilman? He hosts one of the shows here. He's a big Greco guy from Minnesota. Now he and I wrestled at Liberty together. We were teammates, but anyway, point if you knew who he was, I was the point that he was a very good Greco guy. We competed the same weight class some during our time in college, and I did not tie up with him. That's for sure. Cameron Hamilton, welcome to the Good for America podcast. It's great to have you, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
For being here
Always
today.
good to see you.
Good to see you as well. By way of intro, for folks who may not know as much about your background, you're a former Navy SEAL.
Once upon a time.
And 10 years of service to our country in the Navy. Thank you for that. You've got some experience in defense contracting. You worked for the State Department. You worked for Department of Homeland Security. And then we met when you were a congressional candidate in the 7th District of Virginia, just a little bit north of Virginia's 5th. And so we met on the campaign trail. We'll talk a little bit about that. You were the administrator of FEMA under President Trump, appointed by President Trump to oversee that. Talk a little bit about that. You had a brief candidacy for RPV, Republican Party of Virginia chair. We'll talk about that as well. And you're married to your lovely wife, Karen, for 17 years, and you have 3 outstanding children. You can tell a lot about a person by seeing their children, and I've been around your children several times, and you and Karen are doing a great job in that respect.
Thank you. God has been good.
Amen. So we first met now going back to 2022. Now about 4 years ago, gosh, it's hard to believe it's been 4 years. We met on the campaign trail. I heard about you from some friends on the conservative side. And there is, for those who don't know, there is a battle between conservatives and moderates in the Republican Party, or establishment folks and the grassroots conservatives. But we met in 2022 when you were running for the 7th District nomination.
At that time, it was held by Abigail Spanberger, who's now the current governor of Virginia. It was believed she was going to run for re-election in 2024. And so she hadn't dropped out of that race until much later. Now we currently have Eugene Vindman.
Okay, let's correct. You were running in 24, so we met in early 24 because you were running last
23.
cycle.
We met in 2023.
We met in 23 for running in 24. Thanks for correcting me on that.
Yep.
So tell me about how you came to run for Congress and what that experience was like. You lost by a whisker. We came in hard for you, trying to help you. The Freedom Caucus endorsed you. All the conservatives were behind you. Talk about your experience running for Congress, what led to that, what the experience was like.
Really, it was a unique opportunity. I will say that if you want to create some chaos in your marriage, you can quit a high-paying government job, give up your pension, and then convince your spouse, I'm going to go unemployed and run for public office. So over the series of months in 2022, as well as 2023, I had some very influential people to me advise me on whether or not I was going to be involved in a higher level in politics in some capacity. Eventually, the crossroads was reached where a good friend of mine, Nick Freitas, essentially said, put up or shut up. It's time to make a decision on whether or not you really want to commit to serving this country in a whole new way. And Nick was an incredible guy, very supportive, respected whatever my decision would be. But him, as well as a few others, were extremely influential in convincing me of the greater concern to our republic without strong legislators in the federal House. And so over time, over prayer, and over many nights of kind of analyzing the risks, the rewards, my wife and I made the decision to do it. So I turned in my resignation from the Department of Homeland Security. At that time, I was serving as the director of EMS, overseeing medical standards and oversight of all EMTs and healthcare providers below the physician level at the department.
Big job.
And awesome responsibility.
You had like 4,000 or 5,000 employees or something like that.
That's correct, that I directly managed. And so really it was a tremendous responsibility, but the call of serving in the legislature, specifically in the House of Representatives, was unique, unlike anything else. And as I declared my candidacy. I was a clear front runner. And then another candidate who had run in a previous cycle entered the race after mine.
Right.
So leading up to my decision, of course, you analyze what does the field
I'm
look
going to
like?
interject for a second. That was
Of
a
course,
guy named Derek
that's
Anderson, who
correct.
was the establishment choice, who would have been a puppet Congress member who did whatever the party told him to do.
Yeah. So Derek grew up in Spotsylvania County, definitely more moderate on many issues than
Yes.
I. That was clear. Um, but having said that, he was a service member. He served this country honorably as a Green Beret. We also had a Marine that jumped into that race. So it was a bit of a crowded field. I
Was,
think
yeah.
7 candidates at one point in time. Really, the race was between myself and Derek. And and so what I did is I ran hard on the issues and I dedicated to simply telling the truth, convincing Virginia voters of the ideology that I subscribe to and why that would actually bless them far more than other approaches. And we made great headway. Ironically, as a extremely conservative candidate, as a Freedom Caucus backed and endorsed candidate, um, you tend to think that, oh, he's a hard right individual. There's no way you're going to appeal to moderates. And so there's at times within the political system of consultants and analysts, there's a calculation over viability.
Right.
I was looked at as a less viable option because of my firm conservative positions. But ironically, I had made more headway with moderates than any other Republican because at least they saw me as someone that was reasonable and as someone that was also willing to hold my own party accountable.
They trust and respect you, your transparency, your honesty, your integrity, even if they don't agree with you on every issue.
Correct. And ironically, one of the key topics that really differentiated myself from other candidates was I was very clear and vocal about how the United States should not be perpetuating this war in Ukraine. We should not be sending billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer funds. I had a really intriguing conversation with a Democrat, very, very adamant, very vocal Democrat who would never vote and support me. And she asked me, why don't you support the Ukrainians? You're a puppet for Vladimir Putin. I said, can we stop and just break this
That
conversation
is,
down?
if you're against involvement in Ukraine, whether it's
By
our
default,
national security
that's
or
right.
whether it's the resources that we're borrowing to send over there, that means that somehow you're supporting Russia because you're not in favor of.
From her perspective,
Yeah.
that's what she communicated.
Right.
So I asked her a very sincere question. Do you know anyone that serves? She said, yes, my nephew. I said, do you know why I don't want the United States involved in that war? It's because I don't want your nephew to fight, bleed, and die on that soil that strategically will not bless or benefit American people and the American foreign policy apparatus. And not only that, I believe that the precious blood of patriots that are willing to serve this nation deserve to be contended with and dealt with to the level of severity of their cause and oath of office. So my whole point was I value the life of your nephew far too greatly to deal with his life so cavalierly and so recklessly by getting the United States involved in key strategic actions that I believe would embroil the world in another nation state war. And so when we talked about this conversation and I gave some perspectives, her whole lens changed. And her perspective was, okay, I don't agree with the outcome, but I completely understand now the rationale with how you've come there. And I can say that it's one of goodness and decency and not just you're a party of naysayers. You want to be an obstructionist. You don't want to help our allies. And that's really one of the key factors that I found within the conservative movement while running as a candidate is when you unpack the principles, but in a way that uses talking points and conveys a different message of goodness and decency, there's great blessings that come from conservatism, far more than it's, well, we're just anti-Democrats. But the consequence from a positive perspective far outweighs the negative. And at times in politics, you know this all too well, there's a focus on the negative, what we're not. You define what your opposition is, you define what you don't stand for. And sometimes that leaves a lot left to be desired about defining what you truly are. And when I ran with that message, I made significant headway in peeling people away from what would be a more moderate or even left leaning base to see that perhaps I was a candidate that should be taken very seriously.
Yeah.
So it was a unique experience. I learned tremendously. I met some incredible people, of course, present company included. And it definitely, it was difficult to see the loss that I had when I lost my primary. But I was a man of my word. And I promised Mr. Anderson that if he won the primary, that I would pray over him. and that I would dedicate this race to ensure that God's will be done in all things, regardless of my own, intent and wishes. And albeit, of course, I'm biased, he was not the candidate that I
Right.
wanted to win that
Right.
race. But I wanted, most importantly, the providence of God to ring true no matter the outcome. And so
It's
I fulfilled that promise in the end. He was unsuccessful. Eugene Vindman ended up becoming elected as the next representative, and then Abigail Spanberger ran for governor the next cycle.
Yeah, so we continue to have in the 7th district, which is a competitive district. It's something like a 52-48 kind of a
For now.
district.
Yeah.
For now, exactly right. That's another conversation which we may have here, but we continue to have it held by ultra-liberal Democrats from going back to 2018 when Dave Brat lost to our new liberal governor, Spanberger,
Mhm.
and then in subsequent elections, we've Nick Freitas, the aforementioned friend of ours, conservative warrior, who lost very close in 20, and then
Leslie Vega ran in
Leslie Vega in
22.
22, you and Nick, or you and Derek Anderson in 24. As believers, we share our faith and our love for our Savior, Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Um, you feel led to do something. My situation was a little similar. I left a 15-year job at Liberty, my dream job working in athletics, fundraising for the Flames Club at Liberty, to quit and run for Congress. Went for a year without income to do that. A step of faith, was an underdog, wasn't expected to win and all that. But when you go through that and you make that decision where you and Karen prayerfully decide together, you feel like the Lord is leading you to make this life-changing decision with no guarantees,
That's right.
Feeling peace and desire and affirmation, this is the right step. And then it doesn't work the way you hoped.
That's right.
Um, and I often say we have to have an internal perspective to make sense of anything.
Of course.
But we don't always know why the Lord allows us to go through a valley or a difficult journey. We could talk about that with respect to other things, and why the outcome, okay, Lord, you've told me to run. Did you tell me to run to lose? Oh, how come I didn't win? Because I believe that you led me to run. Talk about how you guys sort of are trying to, I'll say, make sense of that, to uh, uh, embrace that, if you will, reconcile that. Just how that was after the race.
We took it really hard. Some of the supporters I had were just absolutely incredible. And I won 5 of the 9 different counties, principally the western counties. So the rural communities turned out in droves to support me.
And I might add, by the way, to lose to someone who doesn't share your eternal perspective,
That is
your scriptural worldview, and your faith.
Yeah. It definitely was a challenge. We had a lot riding on this, and it was a sacrifice, obviously, to make that decision. Coming into it, of course, my wife was less thrilled about the prospect than I was, which
Yeah.
is natural. You have a protectionist mindset, and she thinks about our babies. She thinks about the future and providing as a family. And she took that step of faith with me, however. And we had a moment of reflection after the election had subsided the way it was. And the hard part about leading up to the election, the actual primary date, is there was a large majority of undecided voters.
Yeah.
The polling had he and I quite literally neck and neck.
Right.
And 2 polls had me ahead by 2 points. So it was really difficult, but there was a big portion, probably 25 to 30% of the Republican electorate that was still undecided. Enough
That's
to
where the
easily
money
sway,
matters. That's where the money
easily
matters.
swayable.
Yeah.
And so we didn't really know how things would turn out. What we anticipated is if it was ironically lower turnout, that would favor me. If it was higher turnout, it would probably favor him.
Low information voters. Honestly.
Correct. And so, having said all of that, after I lost, the next morning I woke up early. I went for a couple mile long run, and we stopped and we prayed and we tried to analyze what's next. And so my first instinct was, well, I need to get back to work, and then I need to piece this together and figure out what the next step is. So I took about a day or 2 to analyze. I had a friend of mine reach out to me about a business opportunity. So I started doing some contracting work, and still was being drawn in by some in the Republican Party of Virginia, not the leadership, but certain Republican elements within Virginia asking me to remain involved, asking me to consider running again. And so I will say I kept my finger on the pulse, but I wasn't a candidate anymore. But it was difficult to think about the fact that we believed God was leading us down this path, and
Right.
then it was unsuccessful. And so there was a lot of questioning Okay, Lord, you are sovereign in all things, and your will is triumphant over all. It'd be really great to know what that is right now,
Right.
because I'm kind of at a loss. And I know that there will be a consequence. Christ will use all things to redeem for his goodness. Um, but we don't know what that looks like. And so, what I wanted to do is spend some time in prayer and be patient for what the future may unfold. And ironically, over time, after I had lost my election and leading up towards the general election of 2024, I had been drawn in by certain groups for vetting as a potential candidate for political office in the administration as
Hmm.
an appointee. And so, from one door closing, I impressed enough people of a very conservative persuasion at some key organizations that were looking at vetting candidates. And at the time, the Trump administration was not doing any personal vetting. They were actually farming it out to about 6 or 7 different groups.
Right.
And of course, there's a lot of lobbyists that were trying to put their skin in the game and trying to advance their
This is
candidates
pre-November or post-November, as far as
pre-November.
pre-November.
After November, after the November election, everything transitioned over, and obviously they took a very aggressive role
Right.
in consolidating names. But prior to that, there were some other organizations that were starting to vet me and looked at my background, brought me in for interviews, asked me for feedback on national policy and strategy, specifically in the realm of homeland security and crisis response, crisis mitigation, because of
Right.
my time and experience at the State Department.
Mhm.
And so by one door closing, ironically, another door opened. Sometimes God closes a door, not because he's shutting an opportunity, because he just wants you to push really, really hard.
Yeah.
Other times, he's shutting an opportunity because that's not the route you were meant to go to. However, the experience that you had to undertake was preparing you for something else. I'd like to believe that it's the latter. And arguably, I think God has brought me down a very interesting path. And we can talk about that with my time at FEMA and even afterwards. But nonetheless, all I have is gratitude for the experience. I met some incredible people, again, present party included. I got endorsed by some of the strongest conservatives that we've had fighting for our cause of liberty in the House and in the Senate. I got to meet some of the most influential people in the state of politics, and I got to meet some of the most incredible supporters in my district who firmly believed in the cause of liberty that we espoused. Um, and ironically, my wife now is in the public house.
Yeah.
She directly benefited from some of the infrastructure that we helped build on my campaign to then launch her campaign, which followed. So there's a silver lining to it, and all I have is gratitude, and especially to most importantly my maker for the things that I've learned along the way. I do think it's helped me grow as a man.
And we don't always, again, know the whys. We often get to see it later on. Lord, thank you for closing that door. Thank you for saying no. Thank you for directing my path in a way that I wouldn't have chosen,
Even though it hurts
even
sometimes.
though it hurts. Yes. And, I've often say we don't really want to trust him for our daily bread, as scripture says. We want our decade bread. Lord,
That's
help me to
right.
see for the next 10 years how
That's
you're going
right.
to do it. But everything, we need to interpret things through not through a contemporary American lens, but through a scriptural lens, an eternal lens.
Yeah.
And we know that everything the Lord allows us to go through, it's his desire that we bring him glory, that we influence others for eternity, that he uses it to make us more like Christ, and he uses it to prepare us for how he wants to use us in the future.
That's
I
right.
want to go backwards a little bit before we go forward to something that you touched on. And you were talking about why you were running and some of the positions. You were talking about that conversation with that Democrat lady about Russia, Ukraine. So that's a relevant issue to today. So, and you talked about your reservations or hesitation to send her nephew
Mhm.
to fight, bleed, and die potentially for Ukraine. That's the reason why the founders and the framers of the Constitution gave the authority to commit troops into battle,
Mhm.
to declare war,
Mhm.
to engage in at least sustained foreign conflicts, not the immediate quick response from an emergency standpoint, but
That's right.
engagements, sustained engagement, so forth. They
That's right.
gave it to the
The legislature.
Congress,
That's right.
and particularly the House, the legislative branch, but to the people's representatives, so that that decision would only be made if there was popular support of the people as reflected through the representatives. And the ones who were committing them were the ones who had to go back every 2 years to their district
To seek
and ask for
reelection.
their vote again.
That's right.
Tell just your view on how that's been I'll say, abused by
Yeah.
multiple presidents, particularly over the last 20 years. You could actually argue further back than that. But what Congress needs to do to reclaim that, where's that balance between the president sending troops overseas into foreign engagements, whether it's Iran, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Syria, whether it's Venezuela, wherever it might be, not for quick strike things to reduce a threat or eliminate a threat, but conflict, sustained conflicts.
Yeah. Article 1 and Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution was really written in a brilliant way. And it portrays this kind of give and take between where the power should wrestle. And generally, I think Justice Scalise said it so remarkably well when he used to speak before Congress. He talked about the inefficiency of the American system. When you speak to Europeans, they have a parliamentary system of government. The legislature is also closely connected to the executive. And sometimes there really is no separation. And there are opportunities through efficiency there. And so for example, many Europeans, they see the American model and think that's terribly inefficient. Why would you rule this way? But the founders of our country designed it to be intentional. So,
Right.
Because you wanted to have maximum degree of accountability and you wanted to make it as challenging as possible for the accumulation of power.
Right.
Because of the propensity of tyranny and expansion in areas that the American people may not feel are in their best interest. So, be very clear. The Iraq War was going on when I joined the military. I joined the Navy in 2005. So was Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a mission that was very
as a
unique.
SEAL, knowing you're going to be deployed into conflict.
That's right. That's right. And I signed up during the wartime effort. I felt very strongly about the Afghanistan mission because specifically of the counterterrorism operations going on there. I felt less strongly about the mission in Iraq. That was a much more nuanced and difficult kind of conflict to really reconcile. Now, granted, eventually Congress did fully authorize the president in some capacity. It was delayed. And in my opinion, we used a very aggressive foreign policy model that was more than I think was wise. And the proof in the pudding was by the removal of, Saddam Hussein, who was a terrible human being, awful, awful human being. We actually gave rise to something much worse.
Agreed.
And this is part of the dichotomy of losing thousands and thousands more patriots to a conflict with aggressive military action in a way that might not be in the best interest of this country. So that was part of the reason why I chose to run for Congress, was because being specifically in the federal legislature was a unique opportunity to be in the room and to be a decision maker about consequences like that in the future. And I had been on the business end of bad policy as a service member, and also at the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security as a civil servant. And I was frustrated at how many legislators I perceived to see who frankly could not care less about the consequence of human life.
Right.
And also frustrated at what I believe is an expansion of federal authorities in ways that the founders never fully intended. And so both of those balances, we have frankly, people in the House that never should be there. And then B, we have an expansion of federal authorities under the executive branch that really shouldn't be there. So it's a mix. The only way for me to influence that was by running for state office, by running specifically for the House of Representatives to be a part of that process and change.
When you think about, to your point, constitutional authority, Article 1, Article 2, congressional authority being surrendered to the executive branch increasingly and so forth. Whether it's tariffs, which I think are clearly attacks and clearly congressional authority, whether it's committing troops, as we've talked about, where I think the founders, where it's different today, unfortunately, to our detriment, is the founders, particularly George Washington, warned us about parties.
That's right.
And then therefore loyalty to party versus country.
That's right.
So that now you have members of Congress who wouldn't vote for tariffs just because Trump wants them.
Right.
And you have members of Congress who wouldn't vote to give the president authority to engage or to send troops, whatever, just because the president wants them. And you also have career politicians that the founders didn't anticipate. And back then, I think we had more statesmen taking their turn of service,
right,
and they fought as intensely as we do today. but it is
And they were fairly autonomous in the past, much more than we see today.
Yes, yes. And there was more power in the hands of the individual representative than it's all consolidated now. Let's talk about FEMA. And not coincidentally, but we're starting, I guess, at midnight tonight as we're talking anyway, about another
shutdown.
Limited government shutdown. To the extent there really is a shutdown when almost all of DHS, which you know better than I, has TSA, has Coast Guard, has FEMA, as well as ICE and Border Patrol and so forth. But they're almost all essential, so they'll have to work. They may not get paid if it was extended. Right. And setting aside the fact the Dems are just doing it because they think it's a political reason, it's 100% on the Dems. And the fact that DHS got flush with cash anyway, so the ones they want to hurt aren't going to be hurt, at least not financially.
That's right.
But so FEMA is part of that, though. So what will be the impact? So you served as administrator of FEMA for 5 or so months under the Trump administration a year ago. Talk about the impact of a shutdown on FEMA.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about a couple of other things relative to that.
So FEMA is an agency of 25,000 employees, which you have about 6,000 or 7,000 full-time permanent staff, and then another adjacent core of what are considered temporary or term employees that help surge for disasters or provide response in certain capabilities. Many of those employees are paid directly out of what's called the Disaster Relief Fund, so their salaries are not necessarily perpetual, but they're based upon declarations that come from the executive. The way a natural disaster or an emergency declaration process functions is that the administrator of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which, mind you, was established in the 70s, but was actually a consolidation of about 17 different agencies and functions throughout the United States government for the purpose of consolidating resources and having a singular state of command to coordinate across the federal government. Very specific terms. The inception for FEMA was remarkable, and I think it really was an agency that was intended to do significant good. As we know, over time, the
lot of well-intended programs start that way, yeah.
However, as we all know, and I would say this to even FEMA staff that I worked with while I was there as the administrator, the agency has become bloated. The agency has become very big, and we've actually incentivized and rewarded states in declaring disasters because of fiscally indispensable practices and the lack of sufficient reserves and actual readiness for high consequence scenarios. An act of God, some kind of man-made disaster, you name it. And so with FEMA specifically, during a shutdown, you have about $90 billion of working capital in some capacity that's managed by that agency. Processing of payments and claims will be directly impacted to survivors because some of the administrative staff that deal with financial analysts and also deal with grant management are not considered essential there. So you will see a significant portion that are the employees that physically pull some of the levers to disperse payments to recipients. That will slow, unfortunately. What happens at times when a declaration is made is there's an immediate stabilization or a surge of federal resources. Those response individuals are many times exempted from a shutdown, but if there's no disasters, you've got a readiness team that's not really deploying. So what are they doing? They don't manage grants and they don't manage the functionality of other programs, so they're kind of kept in abeyance and in suspension. You'll also see certain auditing requirements that FEMA is mandated to engage in. Those will be suspended because those staff will be considered non-essential. Of course, you've got things like HR. You've got, other elements and offices within, disability coordination and others that are not truly emergent. Those will have to go away and put on the back burner. The agency exempts about a third of its total portfolio as considered emergency or essential staff. But even that number has shifted back and forth. While I was actually at FEMA, we tried to reclassify. There's 26 different specialties within FEMA. We tried to reclassify it and consolidate it down to 12 so that it was easier to understand. And then of that 12, about 6 would be considered essential staff. If you had this designation on your job, you would be considered essential at all times because you can do a variety of things for the agency to ensure that things continue. Because if we know one thing, FEMA is not just there for disasters. And this is the uniqueness of the mission set, which is why I asked to go there when the administration was interviewing me. It is an organization that is more principally seen by the American people as focused on environmental catastrophes. But in reality, there's an entire subset to that mission to prepare for America's future worst day. There are legitimate functions, and there are what are called 15 different emergency support functions of the federal government. FEMA directly manages 8 of them. So a highly consequential decision and position within the government. Many of those activities will be delayed, diminished, and then procurement opportunities in the event there's a crisis will be drastically reduced. So what this means, we're not able to potentially surge in a time of crisis. We don't have as many resources at our disposal to engage in the administrative functions. And then we have to triage work, which means that when the shutdown ends, now we have a backlog of other administrative functions that has to be caught up on, which then will even further delay payments to actual survivors and or reimbursements to states who've expended money to repair critical infrastructure. All of that is to say some states will clearly be more affected than others. You'll see states like New York, Florida, Louisiana, California, ironically, Texas even, states that have a higher degree of disasters and have high consequence incidents. They will be more impacted than other states like, say, Oklahoma, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, maybe other states where they don't see as sustained a degree, Idaho, for that matter, states that don't see a preponderance of these disaster scenarios. They will not feel the consequence anywhere near as much as the heavy hitting states that use a lot of federal resources. New York, you got Hurricane Sandy. You've got Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria. I mean, many of those localities are still rebuilding. Much of that's because of corruption and lack of appropriate standards, but some of it's also because of bureaucracy, federal bureaucracy imposed through the government that we call the American, the United States. So it's nuanced.
You said 25,000 employees, counting the ones that are when surges happen. How many do we need?
To be honest, FEMA could probably run at half that size.
That's my general rule of thumb that I have found sort of.
And that was actually a plan of mine.
Federal wide is about half. If you could pick and choose without barriers and resistance and
so that was actually something we proposed, was a gradual phasing out of certain responsibilities, because generally what you see within emergency management, and I spent about 5 years working at the State Department in crisis response, preparing to evacuate 30,000 Americans from a war-torn region at a moment's notice. Really tremendous responsibility. There's a lot of key offices in the United States government that people don't know about that deal with this kind of scenario of what do we do if all of a sudden war breaks out between 2 neighboring countries and there's a significant population of American citizens that are stranded. So I took that experience over to FEMA when I was appointed the acting administrator. And what we had deduced is that the federal government has kind of, because of its ease and its scale, taken a primary role. But in reality, a lot of it should be turned over to the states. So that was my focus.
Yes, I want to ask you about
Build
that.
state capacity, shrink the size of the federal bureaucracy. So one of my plans was specifically, we could cut the workforce in half. It would have to be a gradual and phasing out approach, because as you tell, you're a wrestling coach, as you tell a wrestler, hey, I need you to cut weight and cut down a weight class. That doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
You need to give people time and preparation to learn that with a new weight class comes potentially new skill sets, a new competitive environment. And not only that, physiologically, the health of the wrestler, there's decisions that have to be made.
Right.
And so that was my focus and approach. We can do this, but this needs to be a phased approach. We need to include Congress so that whatever actions we engage in are not immediately undone.
Right. Sustained beyond the next president.
Make it lasting so that by the time the administration was completed, we could have shrunk the agency down. My first 3 months there, I saved $3 billion from the operating budget. At that time, it was more than any federal agency in the entire United States government.
Wow.
So we were making good cuts. We were consolidating resources. Unfortunately, there were other factors that got in the way of us continuing some of that work.
So 3 million roughly federal employees, not counting military. And that has been my statement and my observations. You could fire about half of them and operate the federal government about 1.5 million employees or so that's consistent with what you're saying about with FEMA. You talked about the states. I don't know what you say to a person who's in a low risk state,
right,
who's paying for the high value properties for the wealthy in these high risk coastal states. You mentioned some of them, the Californias and Floridas and so forth. But you also talked about it's my contention that you could just about say with all welfare programs, all social services, all entitlements and subsidies and so forth, we've got this warped system to where the dollars come from the feds, but the states distribute it. So the states don't have the skin in the game and don't have the incentive to be judicious or to be good stewards because they're spending the feds' money.
Knowing that more will come.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and exactly, instead of block granting it to the states, they've got a limited amount of dollars. And then for a lot of these programs, phasing it out gradually over time, and the states can add it back if they want to tax their people and do it. The people want that in their respective states. Is that to some degree what you're talking about with FEMA?
It is.
Yeah.
And those were plans and approaches that we had, actually. So there were a variety of different conversations I had with the White House, members of OMB, because they're the president's hands and arms to actually execute his intent throughout the government. And we simplified a couple of key objectives. Number one, how do we build state capacity so that they're more prepared and we're less reliant upon federal resources? Number two, simplify and refine the federal grant process so that people understand how this money comes, when it's phased out, and then create incentives to save money. One of the novel ideas that we actually pitched to OMB was, what if when states get federal grants for emergency management and for homeland defense, what if you create it like an Amazon online ordering guide, if you will? You've got money in the cart and you've got a laundry list of things you can order with it. But what if you created an incentive to way, if you save $5 million, that'll be in an interest-bearing account. The state can keep it, and they can use it for future high-consequence events. You incentivize cost savings. This doesn't happen now. States we've got $200 million. We got to spend all of it. What if we created an incentive for states to be more frugal, to really have a proper risk analysis of what mitigation investment to improve things? For example, in Western North Carolina, there was a mitigation reservoir, a massive reservoir that holds millions and millions of gallons that oversees Asheville. Well, there's a bleed-off channel that was invested in, about $20 million for that project, and it kept the reservoir from failing. If that reservoir had failed, you would have seen probably 10,000 people dead because the trajectory of this water would have wiped everything out in the path. That bleed-off channel that was invested in, no federal dollars were used for this. It saved tens of thousands of lives. You can make a firm calculation that risk mitigation investment in that particular circumstance was worthwhile. My approach at being at FEMA was, we need to find projects like this so that if Congress mandates that we invest in mitigating risk, let's find the things that are really going to help people, not just building parks and putting in benches and planting trees. Let's really do things that save lives en masse and then create incentives. If states can save money, they get rewarded for it in the future. They keep that in an interest-bearing account. The Treasury doesn't bleed as much cash every year. And then when they need a surge of resources for an unforeseen storm, like what we saw with Helene or Milton, states now have money that's kept in suspension or kept in kind of in probate, if you will, that they can use for the future. And it doesn't require that every year Congress has these numbers that escalate higher and higher and higher and higher. Why is that happening? Because every year they're spending every dollar you give them. So every year they need more. And it's this cycle that just continues. And so one of my arguments was, we have to get off that track. It's not just correct course. Get completely off the track, create incentives to save money, and then actually verify that states are mitigating risk, not just spending money because it's manna from heaven.
So the president, back in the 24 campaign, because of the failures and the struggles and the poor management and so forth of FEMA under the Biden administration, the president had called for FEMA to be eliminated.
That's right.
And to your point,
that was in 2020, early 2025. Yeah.
And to your point, most Americans, when they think of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, they're thinking of catastrophic natural disasters, acts of God, and so forth. And you, a few moments ago, were talking about how there's more to it than that. But in a congressional hearing, you courageously had the principle and the consistency to say that you didn't think FEMA should be closed and eliminated. You thought it needed to be fixed.
Correct.
Essentially, that's not your exact word, but it needed to be fixed. It needed to be
refined,
corrected, improved,
streamlined.
and so forth. That apparently and what is perceived by some as some conflict between you and Secretary of DHS, Secretary Nome, led to your departure from FEMA. What can you tell us about that?
So serving at FEMA was a tremendous honor. And we had some meaningful reform we were trying to engage in. We ran into roadblocks pretty quickly because my major concern was that politics were being involved in several different decisions throughout various federal agencies. And I felt that DHS, in my humble opinion, was one of the worst cases of that. And so over time, the feedback that I'd received was, we want this agency to go away and to be eliminated. So when you deal with a high consequence organization that has a lot of responsibilities, the first thing you unpack is who's going to pick up the tab. You don't just eat at the diner for free. Somebody's got to pay the bill. So if this agency is going away, we need to start collaborating across the federal government immediately to talk about who's going to assume what responsibilities.
Right.
And the reason why I say that is because I met directly with members of the NSC on talking about the principles of the 15 different federal emergency support functions that the United States is responsible for. And what the consensus was is, oh no, we love the doctrine. That doctrine needs to say. The Trump administration signed an executive order about moving away from an all hazards approach to a risk-informed approach, but we love that methodology. We think it should stay. To which my point was, okay, so you have these functions that you're saying the president still needs to be able to have levers to do. Somebody has to be there to do them. So what's the solution? And what I found at DHS was a constant, not our problem.
Mm.
And to which I responded, well, that's actually my problem.
Right.
Because I'm responsible for half of them. And I need to tell you and the president and give you sound advice on if we're doing this, this is how to do it wisely. And this is the way we should avoid doing it so we don't make mistakes. And so over time, that became seen as not being a team player. I became labeled as someone that was not on board with
By
the
just
radical.
one person?
By a few.
Yeah.
By my former boss and by her senior advisor,
Mm-hmm.
of which, while I was there, my character was attacked. I was accused of lying and leaking information.
Interesting people to be attacking your character, by
Very
the
much
way.
so. And in fact, I was even polygraphed against my wishes. I was requested after a certain story came out. We had a briefing with the Deputy Secretary of DHS on whether we should abolish the agency, and I was asked to prepare a memo. Like any leader, you recruit the best minds within your organization to talk about the consequences of this decision. So that's exactly what I did.
Right.
I recruited probably the top 20 or 30 key officials in FEMA saying, let's give several courses of action and identify the risk and the benefits to each of them so that at least the secretary can feel we've given her good options and she feels informed. That meeting was published by DHS headquarters on what's called an ESEC framework, where it was visible to about 50 to 100 different senior ranking employees throughout the Department of Homeland Security. Naturally, that got leaked to the media, of which then I was accused and called out of a classified meeting of being a leaker.
Yeah.
So then it was said to me, well, you'll have no problem undergoing a polygraph. So I underwent a polygraph, which was an interrogation, and I was cleared. And yet I wasn't apologized to. And yet I wasn't removed right away, but it became very, very clear to me that my tenure at the agency was going to be short-lived because of what I perceived as one of the most unprofessional working environments that I've ever experienced. And I spent time in a SEAL platoon where my team leader broke a chair over my head and we got into a brawl. Like, I've worked in some pretty tense and difficult environments. I've never worked in one quite like that, where there was so much, in my opinion, manipulation and coercion to simply do things that sounded good for talking points, but weren't necessarily good government policy. And continually my concern was that recommendations and advocacy was coming from DHS that was completely inconsistent with guidance I was receiving directly from the White House. In any position, number one, being the head of an agency that, the commander-in-chief and the secretary says they're going to get rid of is difficult.
Right.
There's no denying that. Number two, when the White House changed its position pretty quickly, but the department wasn't keeping suit with that, it created an untenable situation where basically you have to choose a side.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found is that key decisions were being made for the department without involving the White House. In fact, intentionally to exclude the White House from having oversight. And this became apparent on intergovernmental affairs calls with representatives, with governors. So to make a long story short, this is the backstory which led into my testimony. The morning of my testimony, I actually got a notice.
The congressional hearing testimony.
Correct. The morning of my testimony, DHS notified FEMA that I was to be fired immediately and my access was to be revoked. To which the security team...
Before or after the testimony?
Before.
Wow.
To which
you knew or didn't know?
I knew about this.
You know.
So to which the security team went to my deputy and asked, we received a highly irregular request to terminate access for the administrator, the head of the agency. To which she then confirmed that it was a valid request, came into my office. What would you like to do? So I calmly said, well, I'm going to craft a letter to the Appropriations Committee. I'm going to inform them that I won't be able to testify this afternoon. I'd like to ask you to confirm it with DHS whether or not they actually intended to send that notification. DHS became embarrassed. A certain official within DHS, they walked back that decision and said, never mind, just pretend this didn't happen. So mind you, about an hour before I leave to testify, I packed up my office. I expected that as soon as I'm done testifying.
So it was uncertain at best. It wasn't confirmed at that moment. There was some inconsistency.
I knew it was coming. I didn't know when.
Yeah.
And mind you, I'd also heard from key officials who were friends of mine in the administration, to include Tom Homan and many others, that, the secretary and her assistant have it out for you.
So when you said in the hearing, when asked the question about FEMA, instead of being eliminated, should be, again, I'll just say fixed.
Correct.
You, at that point, were not only answering the question in your honest opinion, but you were also stating what had become the White House position while it was not the DHS position.
That is correct.
So Secretary Noem, she was a somewhat high-profile governor of South Dakota. Many conservatives thought she did a pretty good job there. I was one, though, who was surprised when she was named as DHS secretary because I wasn't aware of anything in her background that particularly qualified her for that appointment. I happen to think that qualification should matter for those kinds of things. I've not heard anything good about her over the past year in her role, and that was before the more sensational public situation with what's happened in Minneapolis, what's been happening with ICE, what she said about that the Second Amendment doesn't apply.
Right.
What are your thoughts on whether or not she should keep her job? Or what would you be willing to say about your thoughts on whether or not she should keep her job?
I think we have better people who are more capable of fulfilling that duty and purpose. I say this as a public servant. Serving at the pleasure of the president is an honor and a privilege, and I've served for 5 different administrations as a civil servant in various different capacities and in the military. Service is a calling, and it is service. It's not self-enrichment.
Yeah.
What I believe is that there are some incredible professionals with a servant's heart and mindset who could execute that job far more faithfully and make the president more successful in his administration's attempts than who we currently have. That's my blunt way of politely saying.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the days or weeks ahead.
She's been strong on some issues. She's also shown, in my humble opinion, some lack of depth and lack of comprehension of other key factors. I think what we saw in Minneapolis was also particularly horrendous. Even members within the law enforcement community felt quite a bit of consternation over some of the aggressive nature of what was going on. The enforcement and removal of these violent felons, to which, to be very clear, the people they're removing are rapists, murderers, some of the worst offenders that you can imagine. But having said that, the deliberate nature of trying to enhance the public outrage and trying to maximize the video carnage of kind of what's going on with that is concerning from a civil liberties perspective. And so, ironically, this is a position that even the White House came to see and came to understand, that this may not be the best approach by being so incredibly aggressive with this enforcement. And it's also terribly inefficient and unbelievably expensive. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars expensive by conducting operations this way versus a seasoned individual who spent a career as a law enforcement officer. Tom Homan has a very different approach. He has Tom's a bulldog, but he has probably one of the biggest hearts of anyone that you could ever imagine. He is truly a miraculous guy. Tom was having his life threatened leading up to the administration. I quit my job and I sat in a truck with a whole lot of guns and a bunch of other guys to protect him and his family on Christmas and throughout that transition period because the last administration wouldn't give him Secret Service protection. So I say this, Tom is someone who is one of the key people that will be one of the most successful agents of this administration.
I don't want to let that slip by. You were personally involved in the security for him and his family.
That's correct. That's correct. Because he needed help. And the cartels were targeting him, knowing the position he was going to come into. And so, again, service is service. When a friend of yours needs help,
well, him working in concert with the secretary, the border czar, and obviously incredible experience. I worked a lot with him.
That's correct.
During my time in Congress, he was a wonderful resource to me and my colleagues. But it's telling they brought him in his words. He said, it needs fixing. I'm coming in to fix it.
That's right.
I'm going to fix it. And the one way that only Tom can talk.
That's right.
And reportedly, they don't like each other at all. You don't have to comment on that if you don't want to, but
that is not a mystery.
Reportedly, they don't like each other at all, and it's just telling that they brought him in to fix it. Well, let's turn to the more recent thing that you, from a sort of a public visibility standpoint, Virginia, just our beloved home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, just picked a Republican Party of Virginia, RPV, kind of the state version of the or RNC, I should say. So RPB, Republican Party of Virginia, picked a new chairman, voted on, selected by the state central committee. And you were a candidate for that. I don't know how that candidacy, what the mechanics of that were, what you went through, how much. I know that you were a candidate, and I thought, gosh, Cameron Hamilton would be great. Gosh, there's no way the establishment, Rhino-dominated RPV State Central Committee is going to pick somebody like Cameron.
Not a chance.
But it'd be great if they did somehow. And I knew that the fix would be in on whoever their establishment candidate would be. But just talk a little bit about why you threw your hat in the ring, why you were a candidate, how that played out, and what resulted in you pulling out.
Yeah. So the losses of 2025, specifically for the Virginia statewide elections, of which my wife ran for the House of Delegates. She ran successfully. She was elected to the House of Delegates in Virginia.
Succeeding our friend Nick Freitas, by the way, and she's in Richmond as we speak, battling for us.
That's right. Carrying some pretty conservative legislation, which is great.
Yeah.
Of course, it's all getting shot down because we are in the super minority. And to be honest, we don't really have a lot of courageous leadership in the Republican Party currently sitting within the House of Delegates.
Correct.
I wish that were a different case. We have some, but we don't have as much as we need. I'll be very clear about that. And so the losses of 2025 were quite substantial. And there was an analysis leading up to the election of this is either going to be bad or horrific. But it was either way, it was going to be a loss. And there's a lot of, it's multifaceted. You had issues with certain candidates. You had issues with campaigns. You had issues with coordination, communication. You had issues with the state house. You had issues with the RPV, with the infrastructure at the statewide party. Some people diagnosed one problem versus another. I firmly believe it was relatively diffuse. But the one key player that could have unified it was the RPV, the Republican Party of Virginia, uniquely suited to carry resources and messaging in a way that would scale and assist other regions and specifically units at the county level to get out the vote and to drive turnouts. The rural counties punched above their weight. They voted about 3 to 5% higher than what you found in the heavily suburban counties. Having said that, it was a catastrophic loss. We lost 13 seats in the House of Delegates. We're 3 seats shy of being able to have the Speaker, currently Don Scott, a Democrat, being able to expel members of the House of Delegates.
With 2/3, yeah.
That's correct. So it was a monumental and catastrophic.
Nobody predicted a 15-point gubernatorial loss. Nobody predicted Jay Jones would win AG, even with the text messaging. Nobody predicted we'd lose 13 House seats.
That's correct.
Worst case scenario.
That's correct. So after the election was over, quite literally the very next day, I had a group of people reach out to me saying, the Republican Party of Virginia is broken. It needs strong leadership. We need a unifier, but most importantly, we need somebody with courage who's willing to tear things down. And who has the ability to run an operational organization that's focused on one thing, driving people to the polls. We saw 500,000 Republicans didn't turn out this election that did in 2024.
500,000 less in a
That's
year's
correct.
time.
That's correct. And some estimates were up to 600,000. So there's a major communications gap. The only organization that is suited to address that problem is the RPV. So I was approached and asked, are you willing to let us consider throwing your name out there as a potential candidate? To which my response was, sure. There currently is an RPV chair. It's Mark Peake, state senator, because Rich Anderson was then appointed in the administration. If Mark Peake is willing to resign, then this might be a real possibility. But if he's not, then this is a moot point because you're running for nothing.
Yeah.
Mark Peake did resign. And that's when it was a put up or shut up conversation between key supporters of mine, of which I had probably 3 or 4 congressional district unit chairs, as well as the district chairs asking me whether I would consider declaring my candidacy. I knew it was an uphill battle. I did. And then others followed. You had Mike Clancy, you had Lynn Bogle, and then eventually you had Nicholas Prophet. And so
who was thought to be the favorite.
Correct. And at the time, Nick
not for merit, but based on.
So Nick's a young guy. He has some experience. He's been on the state central committee for about 6 years, so he's more known to them. So I knew that would be difficult, not because of messaging, but because simply he was more of a known commodity. Within the selection of the RPV chair, normally this is done every 4 years through a statewide convention, except the Virginia bylaws state the party plan that in off cycles, it's an appointment by the state central committee, which is about 79 voting members. So it was really a vote for 79. There was no statewide campaign. So mailers, emails, all of that's ineffective. You have to target your audience to these 79 people,
right,
and then hopefully convince their supporters who put them there, which act as the board of supervisors for the Republican Party, to vote for me. What I found is I was making good headway, but not enough. And I found that over the time in my campaign, I didn't have the support that was crucial to actually guarantee victory. So as a result, and time in prayer, I also had some conversations with key officials in the administration, as well as other strong and principled conservatives nationally who had concern that the Republican Party of Virginia is not quite ready for the reform that is necessary to rebuild it. And so I was advised very strongly, please consider pulling your name out of this race. I think this is going to be a sword of Damocles, and I think the damage is going to get worse. We don't want to see you injured in that. So, no, I didn't pull out to save my neck. I pulled out because my calculation of the votes I didn't think were there. I didn't think I had a pathway to victory. What I didn't realize was that after pulling out, then someone like Jeff Ryer would get in and completely change the trajectory of the election. And so that did occur at the last minute. And then Jeff Ryer ultimately, as a more seasoned and experienced member of the state central committee, former RPV spokesperson for many years, very, very well connected, interesting individual, definitely not as conservative as I, that's to say the least, but clearly a favorite amongst those in the state central committee, to where my challenge to overcome that obstacle would have become even worse.
What were the stated reasons for resistance to your candidacy that you were hearing from people who were on that committee to say, hey,
right,
we won't support you, or we don't think we can support you, or we're not going to support you, not just because I'm for so-and-so, but I'm not for you because...
So there were a couple.
I wouldn't support somebody like you. That's or right. You.
Yeah, there were definitely a couple. One of them was my association with you. Specifically,
glad I could help.
Well, no, Bob, you're a strong conservative and you've done great things for this party. And I was not happy with your own primary. And so I had an association with you. You were the first person to endorse me. You believed in me, of which I've remained incredibly grateful. We love you and your family, and we love the things that you fought for.
Well, State Central, you should have told me, RPV should have told me to endorse one of the other candidates. It might have helped you. Go ahead.
And so, but having said that, that was one concern. Another concern was that I was removed from FEMA as a senior official, and the optics might appear that I had somehow taken a position against President Trump himself. In reality, it was much more nuanced, and my opposition was directly because of what I believed were unwise decisions from the Secretary of DHS and her senior advisor, Corey Lewandowski. But the projection of the administration and the projection of many in the media was very different. So there were some concerns, others that, okay, you've been endorsed by a guy named Bob Good who stood in opposition to the president at different times with the selection of his primary. You got removed from FEMA for having a different opinion against the president. So for standing in opposition to the administration, there were some concerns that you're not going to play well with the White House. And we need the White House to have resources and to provide assistance to the party, as well as other factors that I was also just relatively unknown. I was never a unit chairman. I was never a member on the State Central Committee, and I was a relatively unknown commodity. Ironically, individuals who donated to my campaign when I ran for Congress, who were on the State Central Committee, some of them approached me and informed me that they were not going to vote for me.
Interesting.
Because they believed you're an outsider. You don't have the inside scoop. You don't have the fast track. We don't think you'll be successful. To which my response was, why don't you help me become successful? But there were not enough people on the State Central Committee that, in my humble opinion, wanted radical change. That's ultimately why. The State Central Committee is the Board of Supervisors for the RPV, and I don't believe the State Central Committee at this time is ready for the change that is absolutely crucial to fix the party in Virginia.
It's interesting. It makes me think of Congress, how the long-term members of Congress are the problem, and they're trying to maintain the system, the status quo. They're fighting against change. Congress is designed to prevent you from making change, to resist change, because it's working so well. They've got a 20% approval rating. They've got $40 trillion in debt, a $2 trillion deficit. No one's more unpopular than Congress except for the media, I guess. So why should they change?
That's right.
RPV, Republican Party of Virginia, is a failure. We won't go back to the most recent election. It is dominated by establishment moderate rhinos. Jeff Ryer, I would submit, represents more of the same, the status quo. You would think they would say, we need something fresh and new and different to bring the change that's needed. No, we want to maintain the status quo, if you will. I would submit the party, if you go back to last November, I don't know what our candidate stood for, by the way. I don't know what Winsome Sears stood for. What was she running on? Oh, let's keep a good thing going. That was kind of her theme thing. I don't know what our candidate stood for. We had terrible compromise in who our lieutenant governor candidate was, by the way. And nobody in RPV or State Central Committee cared about that. But then at the same time, you've got these amendments to the Constitution coming up. It's my contention that most of State Central Committee and RPV hopes that gay marriage and abortion get enshrined in the Constitution, so they're taken off the table legislatively and politically.
There's certainly there's more Republicans that believe that than I think many people understand, and that is a serious concern. And so I'll give John Reed a little bit of credit. He actually made his positions on both of those very clear when he ran his lieutenant governor race. But I agree with you. Bob, there's a lot of Republicans.
Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both said they were against gay marriage when they were running for office.
That's right. Yeah, I understand. There's a lot of Republicans that are just hoping that more progressive legislation is enshrined so that the issue is done and the fighting can be over on key and controversial messages. I can recall a circumstance where I was asked to speak to an Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority meeting. If you know anything about the organization, they're a very left-leaning, African-American predominant sorority.
This is where?
So Alpha Kappa, it's national. It's a national sorority.
But you were speaking where?
I was speaking in Fredericksburg, specifically at one of their chapters, and they were very gracious, very polite, and they asked all the candidates for the Virginia 7th, of which Fredericksburg is immersed, kind of right in the middle. They asked all the candidates to come. And I showed up as the most conservative candidate in the race. There were two other gentlemen that were there who were also very nice, gentlemen. But what I witnessed in that meeting was two other individuals give much softer talking points about abortion than they had previously espoused in conservative circles.
Talking to different people now.
And this was concerning to me. And I
Yeah.
look back and I recall staring at my wife thinking, gosh, what is going on here? This just doesn't make sense. You don't change your platform. If you believe that a principle is an immutable characteristic that governs your faith, you don't just abandon it when it's difficult. You stick up for it. Now, you can use tact and adjust how you speak about it in a way that's hopefully relatable so
Sure.
that people see it favorably. And that's what I did. And so when I was asked, I said, look, I know it's controversial. I said, what do you believe about women's reproductive health? And I said, so that's a ruse to talk about abortion. So I said, I know it's controversial and some won't like to say it. I'm unapologetically pro-life because I believe every human being has dignity and worth created in the image of God.
Amen.
And what I espoused to them was not a browbeating, you're a sinner, you're going to hell. It was more of we have to reconcile with this terrible calamity that we're not valuing life in this country the way that it should be. And this is a great and serious moral problem that we have to contend with. And I refuse to apologize for believing that. And I went through the history of Planned Parenthood, how this was an organization that was founded
Right.
on racism
That's right.
as in eugenics.
That's right.
And how basically the political narratives of what you find around this topic now are nuanced and difficult, but a lot of it's propaganda. And if the American people truly understand what goes on with this procedure, we'll come to see it one day as truly barbaric. And that's the message I gave. And after the meeting was over, of course, some didn't want anything to do with me. I had 3 women come up to me, both of which are card-carrying Democrats, to say, I just feel like you're a decent guy. I just feel like I understand who you are. I just feel like you're a good moral man who I could trust with the keys to my car, who I could trust to watch my kids. And what I took away from that is that the Republican Party positions are rooted in virtue, so much virtue. If we would just stick to the creed, but then if we would find a way to relate it to the average Virginian, they would find that it's palatable, it's relevant, it has influence. And when we fail to deliver that message, the position shouldn't be, we'll abandon controversial issues. No. Change our talking points. Change how we discuss it. Find a way to relate to people so that they see the merit in the argument. If I'm trying to sell you on a car, but you don't care at all about the transmission, I need to stop talking about the
That's right.
transmission. I need to talk about elements of this that you will see as, that's a good point. That's a really valuable way to look at it. And I think most people still to this day about the topic of abortion, they don't fully understand what it entails. And we need to rip the Band-Aid off and expose them of the dirty secret that this procedure really is. This is infanticide. And then I went on to speak specifically at this event about imagine the great human potential that we would have. Imagine the God-given intellect of 60 million people that we could have had in this country, providing insight and benefit to expand the collective good of so many others, to create blessings, opportunities, industry, jobs, you name it.
Yeah,
Like
just
imagine
practically serving as doctors and
of
serving as
course,
professors
of course,
and teachers
of
and
course,
laborers and construction workers and scientists and what have you,
everything,
and contributing to our culture and our society.
100%. And that's the framework that I tried to portray it as. There's goodness here. This isn't foaming at the mouth, anti-progressivism. This is standing for something of decency and goodness that comes as a consequence of the Spirit of God moving in people. That's always been my position with the RPV. When we come to grips with that, we are going to be far more relatable. People now, the youth now, are flocking to religious practice in numbers that we've not seen in quite some time. Charlie Kirk was a huge influence in that, among many others. But now, many conservative Christian advocates for policy and platforms are gaining in elevation, and they're gaining notoriety and publicity in ways that we've never seen before because people are hungry for something that's eternal. They're hungry for something that's not relative, but something that transcends. And so that's why people like Nick Freitas have been so successful. Allie Beth Stuckey, so many others, Charlie Kirk, for crying out loud. Evangelicals have been turning out, and it's growing, especially amongst the youth. The RPV, in my humble opinion, will commit the most catastrophic suicide if they abandon that that momentum. And that's my concern, is that we are.
Well, the national party as well as the state party has become about just winning to win,
That's right.
winning elections to have power so that they can retain power and stay in power. And if you'll compromise to win, you'll compromise to stay, and nothing is sacred, nothing is non-negotiable, nothing is worth fighting for, nothing is worth standing for. And that's not inspiring. That doesn't motivate. That doesn't drive passion. That doesn't drive loyalty and commitment. Just that we're just not as bad as the Democrats. And you said it with respect to your wife in the House of Delegates, Karen, about courage. Winston Churchill said that courage is the most important of all virtues because upon it, all the others rest. So without, it doesn't matter your other virtues if you don't have the courage to stand and fight for those. Well, as we wrap up and as we conclude, want to just ask you, what are you doing now? And what does the future look like for Cameron Hamilton?
Well, right now, my better half is serving in the House of Delegates, and she's got a pretty big uphill battle.
She does.
She's representing Virginia 62, which is a great district, the home of James Madison.
That's right.
In Orange and Madison County, just wonderful, wonderful places. But we have parts of Culpeper County, parts of Greene County. Truly, Greene County used to represent for a while. Yeah. Truly God's country. So she's fighting there, and I'm trying to support her as best I can, so that she will be as successful as possible. Although we're in a pretty small minority, and there's a lack of courage, I think, in the Republican conference, but that's a whole nother matter. But aside from that, I'm working specifically in disaster response and recovery. I work for a tremendous firm called LTS as the vice president for disaster response and recovery. And we are trying to build capacity to provide assistance to states. The very thing I talked about at FEMA, building state capacity, that's something that we are directly involved in doing as an organization in Florida, in Texas, in North Carolina, in many other states, in Alabama, you name it. The Southeast gets hit obviously significantly higher than other areas, but we have contracts in California, and we're about providing expertise so that we can help states respond to high consequence scenarios. A lot of it's through logistics, and really focused on reestablishing the 8 community lifelines so that civilization can continue in the event of catastrophe. So a lot of planning, a lot of proposals. So we're doing great work there, and I have a tremendous team that I get to work with. But as far as politically, I still have routine meetings with officials in the White House, officials throughout the federal government, many of which who actually agreed with my position that. It's funny, the secretary just said FEMA's essential. And, I don't know, half a year ago, she fired you for saying that.
Yeah.
And so having said that, the opportunity God gave me to serve with the men and women there, to learn more about the agency and to experience the executive branch at a whole new level was something I would not trade for the world. Even though I met some tremendous people there and I met some less than tremendous people there, God has been gracious and God has given me opportunities. So I'm trying to be patient and wait and see what he has next in store. When I first ran for Congress, I didn't ask to do it. I was asked. And I take the mantle of servant leadership very seriously. That's similar to your story. You were asked to run for office. Yeah. You didn't ask for it. So I'm trying to wait and be patient. And I don't want to be an individual who just inserts myself for self-aggrandizement. I'd rather instead, and I made it clear on my campaign, if I'm not the best candidate for this race, I will happily get out of the race and support the person who I think is. In my race, I didn't think that was the case. Yeah. So I stayed in the race. So I don't necessarily want to pursue politics for the purpose of having my name on some billboard or a fancy title. I want the policies that will bless my children's lives to be advanced. And I want to support that in whatever way I can. Directly, indirectly, in the front, from the rear, you name it. I'm willing to serve in any capacity. So that's my focus. And I think that God is good. He has a sense of humor sometimes too. And so I'm waiting to see what doors he'll open for me in an effort to, most importantly, glorify him in all things. I do it imperfectly. I've made so many mistakes. But that's really my focus and goal. How can I be of service to my Maker? And how can I carry that mantle forward wherever he'll direct me to go?
Amen. Well, thank you for your service to our Commonwealth. Thank you for your service to our country currently and previously. And I will be watching to see how the Lord uses you going forward. Thanks for joining Good for America, Cameron Hamilton.
Thank you, brother.